With that, let's get started.
Awesome. Oh, okay, I can hear myself. Y'all can hear me okay? Super. All right, well, first of all, it's a thrill to be speaking at BSides Las Vegas. Wow. Thank you all for being here to hear me talk about how to make sure that operations stays friends with security. The almost inevitable survey at the beginning, how many of you have done some kind of operations or IT or SRE type of... Oh, great. Good show of hands. How many of you are in here because it's a semi-dark space that's away from all the rest of the hustle and bustle? Okay. I thought there might be a few of those. Excellent. And I know that we have at least one person who's here to cheer me on, so thank you. All right. Well, I hope y'all are going to learn something today. I'm hoping to have this be more of a dialogue. If people have questions, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hands. We do have someone who will be moving around with the mic if that seems relevant. If no questions, hey, awesome. Just, have fun. So why am I the one who should be talking to you about ops and security? Well, I started out in ops. I was a sysadmin. I did some IT stuff. I used to take care of, IRIX boxes, Solaris boxes, DEC boxes, and then eventually moving on to Linux and FreeBSD and more Linux and more Linux. After I'd done that for a while, spending a lot of time dealing with operations incidents, I moved over and started working security incidents and did some security incident response. I've done some security research as well, and now I'm back on an engineering team. I am working for Agari. We do email security, and I am working with some DevOps and infrastructure folks to help get our culture and our more security aware and bake in more security. So on to the interesting stuff. Okay, so when I started writing this talk, I submitted the proposal and I said, okay, let's frame the discussion of dev and ops around the CIS critical security controls. Super great. Most people have heard of them. It'll be pretty easy. Well, right after that, I started at this new job, which I've 3 months today, and I started working with their infrastructure, and I realized that there's a lot that just doesn't actually apply. So the CIS security control number 1 is all about hardware assets, and number 2 is all about software assets. And I started thinking about hardware, and my company is everything is hosted in AWS, so we don't really have any hardware. So I guess maybe instances or VMs or possibly even containers could be referred to as hardware. But then you get to things like AWS's Lambda functions, serverless. Is that hardware? Is it software? I wasn't quite sure, and I decided I kind of needed to reframe things. So, I had to kind of throw out that talk and say, all right, let's think about assets some more. Even more than my dad, who was a financial advisor and money planner and spent his whole day talking about assets. So I'm going to be talking a lot about assets here, and I realized I had to completely reframe what I'm talking about, so out goes this agenda. So the updated agenda, I figured give at least a brief intro to DevOps and SRE, and I'm going to talk about some of the principles of DevOps and SRE movement and ways that they align with good security practices. And then I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about assets, how to define them, how we want to track them, monitor them, what we want to do with them. Then some time on lease privilege and logging. I have some additional material in case I talk really, really fast and I get through all this stuff and y'all don't have any questions that is more about DevOps and what they want. So standard disclaimer, this is my opinions and it does not necessarily reflect those of my employer, although if I have anything to say about it, I will. And non-standard disclaimer, I do hope you like cat photos. So core principles of DevOps and SRE. Number 1 is that everybody shares the on-call, the devs, the operations folks, maybe even some of the QA folks, depending on how mature your team is and your model is. Number 2, practice empathy, understand where the other people are coming from and work with that. And then finally, automate everything you can. Write everything as code if you possibly can. And that will make things easier, and we'll talk about pets versus cattle. So, on-call. Back in the day, the ops team was the only ones that were waking up in the middle of the night, and devs could kind of just say, no, it compiles, it builds, it's not my problem anymore. And they weren't suffering. So even if something alerted every night because of a constraint that had been built into the code that ops couldn't deal with any other way, it was, no, this is an ops issue. But with everybody sharing the on-call responsibilities, we kind of, from an operations perspective, people kind of got, I don't want to say tricked into it, but got convinced to do it because devs wanted to have more ability to deploy code and not just sit there and do the code. They wanted to be able to deploy for testing. And then if they were deploying for testing, then why not deploy to staging? And then if you're deploying to staging, why not deploy to production? And then operations said, hey, folks, if you're going to be the ones deploying to production, well, maybe you should be the ones who are waking up in the middle of the night. So that happened, and it gave the ops team a better idea about what the devs were up to, and it gave the dev team a really better idea about the challenges that the ops folks had been dealing with, and it started bringing the teams together. So that's kind of what where we're going with the empathy, which is just understanding other people's perspectives and those shared experiences of being on call, understanding the real world constraints that maybe didn't show up in the works for me, it works on my laptop type of situation. Really helped start this whole philosophy of coming from a place of understanding and support rather than having this adversarial thing, or possibly even just a waterfall model where things get tossed over the wall between dev and QA, and then from QA to ops, and they don't really interact back and forth. And gave the ops team an opportunity to do something that devs spend a lot of time doing, which is writing code. And so that brings me to automation. Obviously, if you automate it, you're only going to have to do it once. And if you're a lazy sysadmin or a lazy security person, you probably really only want to do that once, and then you can move on to something that's more interesting. It started with CF Engine to allow you to manage systems and users and config files and even software deployments. And then Puppet came along, and there's Ansible and Salt and all kinds of tools that help you manage all of your infrastructure. And even nowadays, you can create instances or containers as code in your automation system. So everything that you can do there is part of the things that you don't have to manage manually. And I just realized that I managed to delete my pets versus cattle slide. I'm sorry about that. I will just tell you about it. So the basic idea was that either you can treat your systems as pets, which is they get a lot of attention, and they're all special. You know their names. And you're friends with them, and you build up a relationship with them. Or you can treat them like cattle, which, get raised in a big herd. You don't have as much of a personal one-on-one relationship with them. And in the end, they go off and do whatever the next thing is, which is maybe feed people or, whatever. You don't have a relationship with them. They're just there to provide a service. And one cow is much like the next cow. But, anybody who has a pet, like pet cat, maybe might say, well, no, they're not interchangeable. This one matters and that one matters, and they're different. So the thought about pets versus cattle in an automation and an operations context is that you want to have your systems be more like cattle, that you don't have to spend a lot of time and energy individually on each one, keeping them up and patching them. If you can patch all your systems at the same time after you've done your testing to make sure that the patches are compatible with all the rest of your software, then you're much better off than if you have to manually log into 10, 20, 100, 1,000 systems and patch them one by one. So treat them like cattle instead of pets. And it's also really great for a security perspective, because you don't want to have too many special things that look different from everything else. The more that you have everything the same, the more you can use baselines and know what's supposed to look like and what it isn't. So that's one benefit of having the cattle model versus the pets. And of course, you're always going to have one or two servers that you have to take special care of. But if you can, do as much as you can to minimize that, the better. So these are some books that I have found are a lot of fun learning about DevOps and SRE. I do have them in the references slide at the end. I am always happy to talk about books. I have a bunch more that I've enjoyed and that seem to be valuable. So there's plenty out there to read. Okay, so on to assets. What even are assets? So I had to think about this. There are so many things that in this personal formulation of mine that I'm calling assets. It's not only the physical servers, the appliances, the VMs, the instances, the containers, Lambdas, even things like S3 buckets, cloud IPs, load balancers, whether cloud or physical. I'm calling domains also assets. I'll get back to that a little bit later some more, but also SSL certificates. And potentially you might want to treat your software as assets to things that you have that you need to keep track of for expiration dates or other things. So it's one of the things that you think about with all of these things is you're paying for them in some way or other. You bought it initially, or you're paying a fee for it being up. So that's kind of my framing on this. So that's quite a few lionesses and cubs, and you want to be sure that you know where all of them are. I mean, if you're a ranger in a conservation park that has a bunch of lionesses and cubs, you're not going to want to let the tourists go drive around on safari if you don't know where all the lions are, because if you do, maybe that, they could get eaten, and that would of course be bad. You don't want to lose any tourists or have anything dangerous happen to them. So these are some things you pay for. You do definitely want to track them. So you want to make sure that you're paying only for the things that you're using. If you've done your blue-green deployment, which is the model where you have one set of systems that is running in production, and then the other set of systems that's running the new version, and you swap, and now the one is in production, the other one isn't. Well, now you've got a bunch of assets, whether they're instances or containers or servers or whatever, that used to be production, they're not anymore. Well, do you turn them off so that you're not paying for them anymore? Do you immediately roll them into the next version? You want to make sure that if you're not immediately using them for something else, that you turn them off so that you don't get charged for that. You also probably want to make sure that as I said, you've got them all shut down when you don't need them anymore. Another reason to keep track of your assets is you want to make sure that you're working on the right environment. I mean, some people are lucky enough to be able to pen test against their production environment. Most of us have to do our testing against staging to make sure that the customers aren't actually impacted. Well, how do you know for sure that you're testing on staging? If you're like me, you have a lot going on and you can't necessarily keep up with everything that the infrastructure team is doing and what is production and what isn't. Now, the ops side, engineering side, will often say, oh, well, we can just go to our cloud provider and look it up there, or we have this cloud tool that will do all this kind of stuff. But that tool is probably not going to give you any way to show who actually owns the asset. And it's probably also not going to say what the purpose of the asset is. So unless you have really informative host names, you don't know for sure exactly what it's going to do. So a centralized asset database can help you find out all this stuff. and it's a good place to track your assets. Just having it all in one centralized place rather than going from spot to spot to spot. So story time, I had my first incident in my new company was there was a system that was running TCP dump, and all I had was the IP address. I didn't know what the host name was. I didn't know why it was running TCP dump, should it be, and I didn't know who owned it because all I had was the IP. So I went and I realized, I have 5 AWS accounts. Even with the command line, it's still a nuisance to go in and look through each of those accounts and try to find that IP. Went to my cloud tool. It wasn't really obvious. I hadn't ever logged in before they'd given me an account, but I hadn't been able to play around with it. Couldn't find the IP there. I had to finally go to our SIM, and I was able to find out what the host name was only in the SIM, because of course DNS lookups didn't work from my laptop in the office to the AWS infrastructure. I would have found it a lot easier and a lot less. It would have been an immediate non-issue if I had been able to see that this was a testing instance that some of the folks were doing to try to reproduce a customer problem. Hey, yeah, of course they're going to run TCP dump. They want to see exactly what's going on and how the packets are flowing. They can do that on their test environment. So that's one case where it would have really, really been useful for me. So I know this isn't an easy problem. Even the NSA is having trouble with it. And I think that's pretty rich, given that Rob Joyce, who is the former head of the NSA's Tailored Access Operations team, actually gave a talk at Enigma, Usenix Enigma, a couple years ago. And one of the biggest points in his talk was, hey, please make sure that you track all your assets. It was a really good talk, and it's basically, hey, get these basic things right. But that's, I guess it's a lesson in sometimes people don't practice what they preach. So how do we help? So this is an exchange that happened a couple weeks ago. Somebody had been communicating with their the team that they were working with to do some pen testing, and they had found only some of the assets, and so they knew they had more surface to explore, and then somebody else found 120%. Well, that's awesome. So what kinds of things do you do? So we like to collect data, right? If you have DHCP logs, if they're sending into your SIM, if you're using DHCP, that can be a good way to find assets. And you're already getting that data. The scans that you're doing to discover vulnerabilities or just find out what's out there may be useful in building your asset inventory. And, just gonna, hey, you can help them by giving them this kind of information to make sure that they know about what all those systems are and what they do. So assets should be tracked and monitored. And so I just talked about some ways that you can help ops track and monitor their assets. One of the things that's really hard, even for people who have got some kind of asset monitoring, is how to update that asset database. Because a lot of places it's tied into their automation tool, and if you don't boot up the automation tool correctly, if it's shut down, if it's misconfigured, if it's not running, then that host isn't going to check in and they're not going to know about it. So we still want to know about these things because we're still paying for them, because they are still part of the attack surface for our company. So we definitely want to do that. We are scanning, we're discovering new assets. As I was saying, you are probably doing these anyway to find vulnerabilities, to find systems that you didn't know about, and hey, why not share? And the other point is tying this back into DevOps. With the dev team now being able to create instances or Lambdas or whatever, just as part of their work, they're probably not as good as a traditional ops person in knowing how to harden a system, even thinking about, okay, if I'm going to create an instance, am I starting from a secure one? Am I just pulling some random instance in from the marketplace, which could have who knows what in it? I mean, it might already have a Bitcoin miner built in. Probably not, but it might. And you want to be sure that people are doing, everybody, dev and ops, is doing the right thing there. So it's good to do some scans and help reinforce what they're already working on. Okay, so other thing you want to do as you're scanning is you want to look for outdated rules. I don't know about you, but I don't get told every time there's a new deployment that involves switching from host group A to host group B, or from software A to software B. And so sometimes there can be a deployment where that'll happen, and my firewall rules are suddenly out of date. They're pretty good at telling you if they need new firewall rules, but they're really not very good at telling you if they want you to turn off the old ones. They don't think about that. So scans can help you figure out whether or not you still need the firewall rules. You need the VPC configured this way or that way, or the load balancer pointed in this direction or that direction. So once again, that will help you save money, and it'll help keep your infrastructure more secure, and it'll help remind your operations team that, hey, they should communicate with you as well as with the devs. And maybe firewall rules and load balancer rules are other things that you can manage, like assets, and track in your centralized database. That way, potentially, you can. I'll talk more about life cycles in a bit. But if you have an estimated life of your firewall rule, you have a built-in check of, hey, I know it's time to make sure that this rule is current still, or can I turn it off? Obviously, we're doing scans to find vulnerabilities. So everybody knows about Heartbleed, I hope. Spent too much time on Heartbleed. So you probably do have some automated vulnerability scanner, but as a security person, if you have to go and say, hey, I got a finding, dear dev or ops or DevOps or SRE team, please patch this in your infrastructure, then that's putting a lot of the burden on you. Using the DevOps spirit of automation, if you can have it automatically open a ticket for them so that they'll patch their stuff, that's even better. And then the ideal state, if you can convince people to do it, is have all the infrastructure, the containers, the instances, whatever, automatically updated all by themselves, so that your dev team is just using the latest thing automatically, and your CI/CD suite, which you can use to automatically deploy a build and test and make sure that everything still runs right, can just do the right thing, and you don't have to touch anything yourself. Automation for the win. Okay, so obviously tying into vulnerabilities, assets are things that should be updated. This means things like life cycles, as I was talking about for firewall rules earlier, but also for hardware type assets. This also means, of course, doing those patches that we were talking about and doing your best to avoid tech debt. So asset life cycles. If you got hardware, it gets old, it dies. Ideally, you want to replace it before it starts having failing parts. I know a whole bunch of people who are still running Ubuntu 14.04. Probably about time to upgrade to 16, if not 18. And you want to think about the life cycle of your operating system as well, just in case people aren't. Other things to think about, Lambdas. If you're not using it anymore, anybody who is using them in prod, you just kind of set them up and there they go, and they keep running, and you input stuff into them, and hey, if you've updated and you're using newer Lambda, you may not turn off the old one, but if you've got a life cycle for it, then you're automatically prompted to turn that kind of stuff off. So that's useful. Domains and SSL certs, as I was saying, they do have an inherent life cycle of a year or 2 years or whatever. And your DevOps team should be monitoring for that, but the security team is probably going to be the one that gets yelled at if they don't get it renewed in time. So it might be a good idea for you to build in some kind of lifecycle awareness. And as I was saying, if you've got that centralized asset database, if you can put that lifecycle field in, then you're automatically doing the right thing and making sure it gets renewed in time, so nothing bad happens there. So some things about how you sell patching in lifecycle. So obviously tech debt is bad. You don't want to have things building up and building up and building up, because if it does, then it's much more likely that there will be a software vulnerability if they haven't patched it, or if they haven't updated to the newer version of whatever major tool it is. And I kind of think, well, okay, folks, I keep making these tickets for you to patch your vulnerabilities. Well, maybe a little bit better would be if you build in some automation to automatically do that. I'll stop bugging you. I'll stop coming to your stand-ups and saying, hey, folks, now there's 10 things that need patching. Yeah, yesterday it was 10, now it's 12. And, leveraging Ops' desire to just have everything happen automatically with minimal interaction is going to be a really positive thing. So let's see. Let's move on to lease privilege. So you do want to control the use of admin privileges. Not everybody needs admin or, root access to your AWS account. Not everybody needs to be able to log into production. I know that the security team probably does want to be able to in case of incidents, but you probably want to restrict the dev and the ops folks who can and run things on there. One thing that I have noticed is that, we're all kind of a little scared of the legal team coming down on us. We're all a little scared of auditors. And if you cut down on who has admin privileges, you can help them reduce that fear. And you can also sell it to people as, hey, if you don't have the permission to do that, if something weird happens, then I'm not even going to look at you as a possibility, because we all know dev folks who will just kind of log in and start making changes on things if they have the ability to try to get something to work better, and then it's not controlled, and your auditors say, well, what happened here? And you're like, oh, looks like it was Joe again. Joe, come on, stop doing that. And those privileges are also, I think, things that you probably want to regularly audit. I just started at my company, and it looks like nobody has audited that kind of stuff for a while. And so I'm having to start from zero, and I really wish they had looked at things even every 6 months, if not every 3 months. So you can help your other security folks out by setting that up as something that is regularly checked on. Logs. I mean, I think we all really do like logs, and while we may not like looking through the logs for interesting stuff, it's really important to have them in case you need to do some investigation. If they don't already have, if the DevOps side doesn't already have a big fascination with the logs and being able to debug things if things go wrong, well, that's kind of unfortunate, but it gives you the opportunity to preach the gospel of visibility and debugging capabilities. So I don't know if anybody remembers Ren and Stimpy, but I thought I'd throw that in there. So if we help ops to, all the things that we all want to have logging to our centralized infrastructure, sometimes your ops team will find that they want to use those logs as well. Nowadays, it's easier to give granular access. You can set up your SIMs so that some people can only look at these kinds of logs and not that kind of logs, or these kinds of events and that kind of events. And just a reminder that I always throw in there when I'm talking about logs, I always start with the outbound traffic because it's the most fun. So, next thing, data protection, just a couple of notes there because it's been really a problem lately. So some real world examples of data protection failures and things, how you can make them more relevant for your ops team. So your company's code in GitHub, I think you can also treat it as an asset. There are so many things that you can find there that maybe your ops team hasn't even thought of the security implications. Obviously, you're not going to make all these things publicly available if you think about it, but the hackers will look for all these things. Dome9, that's a cloud security company, checked some AWS API keys into GitHub in a publicly available repo just to see what happened. And they found that the first time that somebody went and downloaded them was 3 minutes later. So if that gives you some ammo to help convince your ops team that they want to take a look at these things and try to prevent it. So, okay, if you've found some of that sensitive data, a reminder to you, just because you may not use Git day in, day out, if they just commit over it, then you just go back one commit in the commit history and you will see all of the information. But if you actually go in and remove the commit, that's the way that you can clean the history out and the data will no longer be there. Obviously, rotate the credentials. Trufflehog, if you want to look into finding stuff in GitHub, Dylan Airy, I think is how it's pronounced, talked about this at BSides San Francisco. He gave a good presentation about it and Trufflehog and some things that he's working on. I actually have a link to that in the notes. I mean, nowadays, AWS themselves are looking for AWS API keys in places like GitHub, and they will also reach out to you. But I think I'd rather find them myself rather than waiting until AWS gets around to scanning it. So S3 buckets, I do think that they're assets as well. There's no way in the AWS UI to tag them, unfortunately. So unless they're named to reflect what they are and what their purpose is and their life cycle and so on and so forth, you may not know. My company is just barely 10 years old, and I found an AWS bucket that had been created, about a month after the company started, and they hadn't been thinking about permissions quite as much as they ought to have. There wasn't anything in there that was super secret or needed to be secure, but there was also no need for it to be there and no need for it to be out in public view. Nobody had ever gone back and looked at all of the buckets, but fortunately now at AWS there are a few tools. You can just use the S3 UI. There's Amazon Macy, which will actually monitor not only permissions on the buckets but also some of the contents, which is kind of cool. So with that, we are doing pretty well on time. Does anybody have any questions at this point, or shall I talk more about ops and how to win them over? Good question. Yeah, it's coming.
Just going back to your point about automation. So I work in a hospital. So a lot of people are afraid of automation because there's a lot of possibilities that things might break, especially if you automate patches per se. Do you have any suggestions on how to actually make some friends?
Yeah. So how do you help people overcome their fear of patching? That's a great question. My best suggestion is to, if you can, build a test environment, a little isolated network. I know it means that you have to have one of this device and one of that device and so on and so forth. But if you can just pull one out of the rotation and test your patch on it and, make sure it works, that's really the only thing that you can do. I mean, I understand it's so hard in a hospital network because you have the requirements of not only all of your PII and PHI that needs to be secure, but also sometimes the tools just don't get the updates themselves, and you don't even know if the OS update is going to be compatible with your tool, and that's important. If you don't have an ongoing support relationship with the vendor, which would be the best thing, is making it their problem. That they have to comply with all of these, various compliance frameworks and HIPAA and so on and so forth. Then the best thing that I can recommend, it's not necessarily going to be easy, but is you've got to test it yourself. You can't just roll it out anywhere, everywhere, and hope for the best. Not in that situation. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, beeping. Alrighty. So, a little bit more about what operations people tend to want from their security teams. I did an informal survey of a bunch of folks that I know who work in operations, and I asked my own DevOps team at work what it is that they want. So here's some stuff that they came up with. They said, okay, transparency. If they don't know yet who's on the security team and what they do, then they are going to be less likely to just think, oh, well, I should check with the security team if there's something going on and I'm not sure what it is, or I don't know what the implications are of making this change to our infrastructure or to our application or to our system. A past colleague of mine, we had a lot of fun doing a security where we would brew up some pots of tea and we would invite people from engineering and operations to come over and just hang out with us and be social and just interact on a more personal level, and that just gave them more opportunities to get to know us and learn a little bit more about what we were about, and maybe ask us questions in a less pressured environment. And if they didn't want to ask something in front of the whole team, hey, you could, they knew who we were, they knew where we sat, they could come over and talk to us. And so one of the other things is they want to make sure that that ops knows why the security changes are being recommended or are being made, and they want to really understand what the security team is about and what their main goals are, because they don't want to be antagonistic with their security teams, but also they do want to understand stuff. They're curious, just like security folks. So next, ops would like you to be realistic, which is to say, yeah, there are some security changes that are really important and they have to go in, but at the same time, there are some things that are going to give you just a little bit of win, and they're going to impact productivity. They're going to impact an engineer's workflow a lot. So the more that you can do to help the understanding of what's going on and why and how it's not going to make their work harder, the better things will be. I don't know how many of us said, hey, have said in the past to our colleagues, hey, don't work from the coffee shop because, public Wi-Fi is insecure. Or, hey, we're all going to this big security conference. Maybe you should, put your phone into airplane mode for the entire time you're there. That's not realistic for a salesperson. They're going to want to be available for their customers. So, try to match what is a realistic threat model. If somebody doesn't have any private company data, maybe there's less of a risk of them getting hacked at a security conference. The other thing is, if you're making it easy for people to do the right thing, it will be more likely for them to do it. So respect. I was going to title this empathy, but talked about empathy before. So if we all know that the security team is supposedly the team that says no a lot. And the more that you can explain why something is happening, I've found, and just treat them like smart folks who want to learn and want to do better, the operations team will understand. They will cooperate. If they understand, they'll buy in better. And when you're starting out to make things happen, starting out with small changes to prove that you're not going to just break everything just for the sake of breaking things can also be a big positive. I know that kind of goes against the model of patching vulnerabilities where you go for the biggest risk possible and mitigate that and then work down the line. But sometimes you've just got to build a relationship before you can start coming in and giving people orders. So the more that we can know their priorities and help them out, and we can help frame what we're trying to do, the better it will be for everybody. As I said, ops does want to learn new things. A lot of folks in ops and dev nowadays, DevOps, SRE, have come in from non-computing backgrounds. And so they have lots of questions, and they've also, by getting as far as they have, proved that their ability to learn. And so, they'll love hearing, hey, these are all the details, or I found this really neat hack. Read about this. I'd like, if you have any questions, talk to me about it. That's a lot of fun. I have personally found that taking the time to reach out to people and teach will pay off later, because the other thing that goes on, I had to throw up this Swift on security thing that says, ops really is doing a lot of security work. The other thing that ops wants, they want jobs. Everybody's hearing about how security is a lot of fun and how there are a lot of job openings. And yeah, there are also a lot of job openings for DevOps, but sometimes you find somebody who's really curious and who likes learning new things. You can start feeding them security knowledge, and then you can hire them, and they'll be on your team. And they will already have relationships with ops because they've been there, and that is going to help them out a lot. So, final thing, if none of these other things work to motivate your operations team, give them shiny things. I do prefer to call it a reward rather than a bribe, but if you just want to be blatant there, you can call it a bribe. Everybody likes stickers. How many stickers are there floating around here? Cube toys, also fun, although I think fidget spinners are a little bit dated. Chocolate, rarely goes wrong. I will just say, though, booze is, I know pretty much all of us here are probably drinking a fair bit this week, but some folks don't drink, so maybe find out a little bit more about them before you buy them a bottle of whatever alcohol. There are some really awesome ginger beers and root beers that are craft and fun that you don't have to give people alcohol. So with that, I'm kind of saying, these are a bunch of things you can do to work with your ops team and help them succeed. Some of them, maybe even most of them, hopefully all of them, are things that you are already doing. If not, these are some more things to think about. So, thank you very much. And so, if you have more questions, now would be, I see a hand over in the back corner there. Awesome.
Do you consider IAM policy to be an asset, and do you let your DevOps team, because it's kind of hard not to let DevOps control IAM today with Lambda functions and stuff. How do you make boundaries? And
I'm pretty much anything that you can audit. I think you probably want to consider it as an asset. As you're starting out, obviously, you're probably not going to start out with a security person or somebody who's thinking about, I should make sure I review this, once I have 2 developers who stayed and then there's the one who left. They're probably thinking more about how do I pick up that person's workload than they are about how do I, turn off all of the access that they have. So it's, as things evolve, doing things like, making sure that the root access to AWS is the main one that is able to set IAM policies. That's useful. There are tools. AWS Config now will actually help you audit your IAM stuff, so that when you're trying to make sure that people are only doing what they should be doing on AWS, that that they have, they do have some limitations. Yeah, it's, if you're lucky, you can potentially even check that stuff in to your source repository, and then you're definitely treating that as an asset. Just only thing I can say is you have to first sell them on the necessity of restricting the control, and then audit and review to make sure that you're that they have the right access that they need. It's a philosophical thing whether you give them possibly a little bit more access than they need and make sure they can get their job done, or give it to them in dribs and drabs until they are able to do everything that they need. It also depends what stage your company is in. If you're in a bigger company, there's probably a little bit more tolerance for starting small and then adding permissions, versus if you're at a big company, you're probably going to want to start with more and then cut back gradually as they are convinced that they don't need this or they don't need that, and you can justify it. Just let's wait for the mic.
Would you characterize customer data as an asset as well? And if so, what's your point of view in terms of devs' treatment of that versus security ops treatment, specifically in the realm of integrity?
Right. So I do think, yes, that customer data is an asset. You can't track in the same way that you do track everything else. I mean, the contents of a database, if you're lucky enough, your asset database with your customer data is probably changing all the time and growing because you're getting more customers. So yeah, you definitely do need to track it. It's another one of those growing pains type problems that I've found is when you're starting out, you don't have any restrictions on who can do what on AWS, on who can access the data, on how it's able to be accessed. But yeah, then as you go, you definitely have to pay a lot of attention to it. You have to get yourself a way to think to control that. And I was torn about putting customer data into this talk, but it doesn't really fit in this formulation because it's such a special thing and there are so many additional regulations around it. There's no easy way to inventory it, but you definitely do want to control the who can get access to it, how they can get access to it. I'd be happy to talk after about this because I don't think there's the one way to do it, but there are a number of approaches depending on what your situation is and what your industry is and how your security team is tied into engineering, et cetera, that you want to think about. So, anyone else? No? All right, well, thanks a lot, folks. This is fun.